Imagine waking up to a completely normal day. You step outside, the sky is clear, and your family is safe. But within a matter of hours, the sky turns violently dark, the earth shakes beneath your feet, and a towering wall of water rushes in to swallow everything you have ever known. It sounds exactly like the plot of a high-budget Hollywood disaster movie, doesn't it? But what if I told you that this isn't fiction? What if this is actually the oldest, most terrifying collective memory shared by almost every single human civilization on the face of the earth? From the dense jungles of Central America to the scorching deserts of the Middle East, and all the way across the vast plains of Asia, our ancestors left behind a chillingly similar story. They all spoke of a massive, world-ending flood. And here is the craziest part. These ancient people, separated by massive oceans and thousands of miles, had absolutely no way to communicate with one another. They didn't have the internet, airplanes, or even wheeled carts to trade stories. Yet all of their myths, legends, and sacred texts point to a remarkably similar timeline, roughly 12,000 years ago. By what seems to be pure coincidence, modern science tells us that 12,000 years ago is exactly when our planet went through a dramatic and violent climate shift, marking the end of the last ice age. Earth was essentially a giant, melting ice cube. So, is it just a global myth, or did humanity actually survive a real physical apocalypse of water? Today, we are going to explore the simple science, the hidden history, and the incredible survival story of our ancestors. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. The visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Sakwa, so sit back, relax, and let's travel back 12,000 years to find out what really happened when the waters began to rise. To understand why almost every civilization on Earth remembers a world-ending flood, we first need to talk about how human memory works. Imagine you are living thousands of years ago. You do not have a smartphone in your pocket. You do not have Wikipedia, written history books, or even an alphabet. If a massive, terrifying natural disaster happens, say an earthquake that swallows your village, or a flood that drowns your entire valley, how do you make sure your great-great-grandchildren know about it? You cannot write them a warning letter. Instead, you have to turn that terrifying memory into a story. You turn the rising water into an angry god. You turn the chaotic storm into a battle between monsters. You wrap the brutal, muddy truth of a natural disaster into a compelling, unforgettable myth. That is the world's oldest game of telephone. Through generations of campfire storytelling, the details might change. The names of the heroes, the shape of the boats, the types of animals saved. But the core message remains exactly the same. The water came. It destroyed everything, and only a few survived. Let us begin our journey in what historians call the Cradle of Civilization, ancient Mesopotamia. Today, we know this area mostly as modern-day Iraq, a hot, arid landscape. But ancient Mesopotamia translates to the land between two rivers, specifically the mighty Tigris and the Euphrates. For the people living there thousands of years ago, these rivers were everything. They provided water for their crops and mud to build their homes, but they were also incredibly dangerous and unpredictable. Deep in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities, archaeologists digging through the sand found something that changed our understanding of human history forever. They found ancient hard drives, Of course, these weren't made of silicon and plastic. They were made of baked mud. These are known as clay tablets, covered in tiny wedge-shaped scratches called cuneiform. It was the first writing system in the world. When scholars finally figured out how to translate these ancient scratches in the 1800s, they were absolutely stunned. Written on one of these broken mud tablets was a story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is one of the oldest pieces of literature ever discovered, dating back over 4,000 years, but the story it tells is much, much older. In this epic, a king named Gilgamesh goes on a journey to find the secret of immortality. He meets an old man named Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh an incredible story. He says that long ago the gods decided to wipe out humanity with a massive flood. But one god, Ea, took pity on Utnapishtim. Ea whispered a secret warning to him through the walls of his reed hut. He told Utnapishtim to tear down his house and use the materials to build a massive cube-shaped boat. Utnapishtim was told to load this strange giant wooden box with his family, skilled craftsmen, and the seed of all living creatures, animals of the field and birds of the sky. As soon as he sealed the door, the sky turned pitch black. The ancient text describes the storm not just as rain, but as a cosmic terror. The gods of the abyss tore out the dams of the heavens. For 6 days and 7 nights, hurricane winds and torrential rains battered the earth. The flood was so violent that the text says even the gods themselves were terrified. They fled to the highest heavens and cowered like frightened dogs against the walls. When the storm finally broke on the 7th day, Utnapishtim opened a hatch. He looked out, and all of humanity had been turned back into clay. The world was nothing but a flat, endless ocean. His giant boat eventually ran aground on the peak of Mount Naimush. To see if it was safe to leave the boat, Utnapishtim did something very clever. He released a dove, but the dove found no place to rest and flew back. Then he released a swallow, and it too returned. Finally, he released a raven. The raven saw that the waters had receded, found food, and did not return. It was finally safe to step out into the new world. Does this story sound familiar to you? It should. If you grew up in the West, you probably know the story of Noah's Ark from the book of Genesis in the Bible. The parallels between the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical story of Noah are impossible to ignore. In the biblical account, humanity has become wicked, and God decides to cleanse the earth. He chooses one righteous man, Noah, and instructs him to build a massive vessel, an ark. Noah is told to bring his family and 2 of every kind of animal on board. Just like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the heavens open up. In Noah's story, it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rise so high they cover the tallest mountains. When the waters finally begin to go down, Noah's Ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And just like Utnapishtim, Noah uses birds as ancient drones to scout the land. He sends out a raven, and then a dove. When the dove finally returns with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak, Noah knows the earth is drying. Now, historians and theologians can debate all day about who copied whom or which text came first. But for our journey, that does not matter. What matters is the why. Why do these 2 foundational cultures living in the Middle East share the exact same terrifying memory? It is not just plagiarism, it is shared trauma. It points to a real, catastrophic water event that was so massive, so destructive, that it scarred the collective psychology of the entire region. The story was so important to their survival that it became sacred. But the memory of the Great Flood doesn't stop in the Middle East. Let us pack our bags and travel east, across the harsh deserts and towering mountains, into the heart of ancient India. Here, the landscape is very different. Instead of the deserts of Iraq, we have lush jungles, the towering Himalayas, and massive river systems like the Ganges and the Indus. But despite the totally different environment, the people here preserved an incredibly similar story. In ancient Hindu texts, particularly the Shatapatha Brahmana and the Puranas, we find the story of a man named Manu. Manu's story does not start with a booming voice from the sky. It starts with a simple act of kindness. One day, Manu is washing his hands in a river when he scoops up a tiny, helpless fish. The fish speaks to him. It says, "Protect me, and I will save you." Manu is confused but agrees. He puts the tiny fish in a clay jar to keep it safe. But overnight, the fish grows massively. Manu has to move it to a larger tank. The fish keeps growing. Manu moves it to a lake, and finally, the fish is so gigantic that Manu has to release it into the open ocean. This was no ordinary fish. It was Matsya, an avatar or physical manifestation of the great god Vishnu. Before swimming away into the deep, the giant fish warns Manu of a coming devastation. A deluge, a flood of cosmic proportions, is going to sweep across the world, washing away everything. The fish gives Manu very specific instructions. Build a massive ship, gather the seeds of all plants, take the animals, and get ready. When the terrifying floodwaters arrive, covering the ancient Indian landscape, Manu boards his ship. The giant fish, Matsya, reappears in the churning, violent waves, but now the fish has a massive golden horn growing out of its head. Manu takes a strong rope and ties his boat to the fish's horn. Through the howling winds and the dark, violent seas, the giant fish acts as a supernatural tugboat, pulling Manu's ship safely through the apocalyptic storm until they reach the highest peaks of the northern mountains, the Himalayas. Notice the beautiful differences and the haunting similarities. We still have the divine warning. We still have the chosen survivor. We still have the massive boat saving the seeds of life. But in the Indian tradition, the flood is often seen not just as a punishment for human evil, but as a natural part of cosmic time. In ancient Hindu philosophy, the universe goes through massive cycles of creation and destruction. The flood is just the universe hitting the reset button, washing away the old age to make room for the new one. Yet, at its core, it is still a memory of rising water swallowing the earth. Now, let us travel even further east, into the vast ancient lands of China, specifically the Yellow River Valley. The Yellow River is often called the Mother River of China because it is where Chinese civilization began. But it has another, darker nickname, China's Sorrow. For thousands of years, this river has been prone to massive, devastating floods that could wipe out millions of lives in a single season. Because the ancient Chinese lived with the constant threat of water, their flood myth is very unique. It is not about a single man building a boat and hiding until the storm passes. It is a story about human willpower, engineering, and fighting back against nature. This is the legend of the Great Flood of Gunung. According to Chinese mythology, the Great Flood did not just last for 40 days. It lasted for over 2 generations. The waters surged so high they crashed against the heavens themselves, drowning the plains and turning the hills into isolated islands where starving people huddled for survival. The emperor ordered a man named Gun to stop the flooding. Gun tried to use brute force. He stole a magical self-expanding soil from the gods called Xyrang to build massive dams and walls to block the water. But you cannot simply block the wrath of nature. The water always wins. The floodwaters easily smashed through Gun's dams, causing even more death and destruction. Gun had failed, and he was punished for it. Then, the heavy burden fell to his son, a man named Yu. Yu looked at the raging waters and realized his father's mistake. You cannot fight the water. You have to guide it. You have to work with nature, not against it. So Yu the Great did not build walls. Instead, he organized hundreds of thousands of people. He became the ancient world's greatest engineer. For 13 grueling years, Yu traveled across the flooded landscape. He surveyed the land, ordered mountains to be carved open, dredged the choked riverbeds, and dug thousands of miles of deep canals to channel the angry floodwaters safely out into the eastern sea. The legend says that Yu was so incredibly dedicated to saving humanity that during his 13 years of exhausting labor, he walked past his own front door 3 times. He could hear his wife crying and his child laughing inside, but he never once stopped to go in, because he knew that if he rested, more people would drown. Through sheer human determination, Yu successfully drained the floodwaters, saved Chinese civilization, and went on to found the legendary Xia dynasty. Look at the incredible tapestry we have just unrolled. From the muddy plains of Iraq to the holy rivers of India, all the way to the valleys of China. In the Middle East, they survived by floating above the wrath of the gods in a wooden box. In India, they were pulled to safety by the divine intervention of the cosmos. In China, they survived by picking up shovels and reshaping the earth itself. The cultural details are entirely different. The heroes wear different clothes, pray to different gods, and solve the problem in different ways. But the villain is always exactly the same, an unstoppable, catastrophic wall of water that ended the world as they knew it. How could ancient people from the Middle East, India, and China, people who had never met, who spoke completely different languages, and who lived in completely different climates, all share this exact same nightmare? Is it just a coincidence that human imagination everywhere independently invented the fear of a global flood? Or is it possible that their ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, actually stood on the shores of a rapidly changing world and watched in horror as the oceans swallowed their lands? To answer that, we have to look beyond Asia. Because if you think the story of the flood is just an Eastern phenomenon, you are in for a massive shock. The water did not just rise in the East, it swallowed the West, too. Let us cross the oceans and see what the ancestors of Europe, Africa, and the Americas had to say about the day the world drowned. Now, let us completely shift our perspective. We have just traveled through the ancient Middle East, India, and China. Those civilizations were separated by huge distances, yes, but they still shared the same massive landmass of Eurasia. A skeptic might argue, well, maybe over thousands of years, a few traveling merchants or wandering nomads carried the story of Noah or Manu along the ancient trade routes. Maybe it is just a really successful ancient viral story. That is a fair point. But what happens when we cross an impassable barrier? What happens when we cross the vast open oceans to a landmass that was completely cut off from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years? Let us cross the Pacific Ocean to the Americas. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had absolutely zero contact with the ancient Sumerians writing on clay tablets. They had never met a Chinese emperor, and they knew nothing of Hindu gods. Yet, embedded deep within the spiritual traditions of Native American tribes, from the freezing tundras of the north to the dense, steaming rainforests of the equator, the nightmare of the Great Water is there. Let us start in North America, with the indigenous peoples of the American Southwest, specifically the Hopi and the Navajo tribes. Their storytelling tradition is deeply tied to the dramatic desert landscapes they call home. In Hopi mythology, they do not view time as a straight line. They view it in stages, or worlds. They believe we are currently living in the fourth world. So, what happened to the third world? According to the Hopi elders, the people of the third world became deeply corrupt and wicked. They forgot their spiritual path and started using their technological power for destruction. The Creator, a supreme being named Thaw, decided to purify the earth. He ordered Spider Grandmother, a powerful spiritual figure in native traditions, to gather the few righteous people who still lived with good hearts. Spider Grandmother warned these chosen people of a coming devastation. She did not tell them to build a boat. Instead, she guided them to giant, hollow reeds. She sealed the people inside these massive, watertight plant stems, along with a little food and water. Then, the Creator let loose a terrifying, world-ending deluge. The waters completely swallowed the continents, destroying the corrupt third world. The people floating inside the giant reeds drifted on an endless, violent ocean for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, the waters began to recede, and their reeds came to rest on the peaks of the highest mountains, allowing them to emerge and begin the fourth world. Notice how the core elements survive the geographical shift. A corrupted world, a divine warning, a chosen few, a sealed vessel saving them from a global ocean, and a mountaintop landing. If we travel further south into Mesoamerica, into the lands of the mighty Aztec and Maya civilizations, the story gets even more dramatic. The Aztecs, like the Hopi, believed that the universe went through distinct eras, which they called suns. They believed we are living in the time of the fifth sun. The era immediately before ours, the fourth sun, was called Nahuatl, which literally translates to four water. The Aztecs believed this entire era was presided over by the water goddess, Chalchutlic. According to Aztec codices, their ancient accordion-style picture books, the people of the fourth sun became entirely selfish and forgot to honor the gods. To punish them, the heavens opened up, and a rain so heavy fell that the sky itself collapsed onto the earth. The flooding was so violent and absolute that the ancient texts say it washed away the mountains and turned all of humanity into fish. However, one god, Tezcatlipoca, took pity on a single couple named Tata and Nena. He warned them of the coming flood and told them to hollow out a giant cypress tree. He instructed them to hide inside the massive log and seal themselves in, taking only 2 ears of corn to eat. Sound familiar? A hollowed-out piece of wood, a chosen pair, a divine warning. Tata and Nena survived the catastrophic washing of the earth, riding out the storm in their wooden submarine until the waters finally drained away. Keep moving south, all the way down the spine of South America, into the towering, breathtaking Andes Mountains. Here, the mighty Inca Empire ruled. At elevations so high it is hard to breathe, you would think a flood myth would be the last thing on their minds. But around the shores of Lake Titicaca, the highest navigable lake in the world, the ancient Andean people passed down the legend of the Unu Pachacuti. In the native Quechua language, this translates to the water that overturns the earth. The Inca believed that their supreme creator god, Viracocha, had originally created a race of massive, powerful giants to live on the earth. But these giants were unruly, violent, and disobedient. Disgusted with his creation, Viracocha decided to wipe the slate clean. He unleashed the Unu Pachacuti. A massive, unimaginable flood swept across the South American continent, rising so high that it submerged even the towering peaks of the Andes. The giants were entirely wiped out. But Viracocha saved 2 humans, a man and a woman. He sealed them inside a magical box and let them float on the furious waters. When the flood finally ended, the wind blew their box to the ancient sacred city of Tiwanaku. From those 2 survivors, the entire human race was reborn. Are you starting to feel the chill down your spine? We are talking about isolated civilizations living in deserts, jungles, and high-altitude mountains, all independently dreaming up the exact same apocalyptic scenario. But wait, we are not done. Let us cross the Atlantic Ocean and land in ancient Europe. We will start in Greece, the birthplace of Western philosophy and democracy. Before the Greeks were building the Parthenon, they were telling stories around fires. In Greek mythology, the king of the gods, Zeus, looked down from Mount Olympus and saw that the bronze race of humans had become incredibly savage. They were constantly fighting, murdering, and breaking the sacred laws of hospitality. Zeus, much like the god of the Old Testament or the Aztec gods, decided to pull the plug. He decided to send a massive deluge to drown the earth. But another god, Prometheus, the one famous for stealing fire to give to humanity, had a son named Deucalion. Prometheus, acting just like the god Ea in the Epic of Gilgamesh, secretly warned his son about Zeus's terrifying plan. He told Deucalion to build a giant wooden chest, or an ark, and to stock it with provisions. Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha, climbed into the chest just as Zeus unleashed a torrential, world-ending rainstorm. For 9 days and 9 nights, the earth was swallowed by a raging sea. Most of humanity perished. Only a few people who managed to scramble to the highest mountain peaks survived. Deucalion and Pyrrha floated in their wooden box until they safely bumped into the peak of Mount Parnassus. When the rain stopped, they made a sacrifice to Zeus, who was so moved by their piety that he allowed them to repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which magically transformed into the new race of humans. Now, let us travel north, away from the sunny Mediterranean beaches, into the freezing, dark, and brutal landscapes of Scandinavia. This is the realm of the Vikings, of Thor, Odin, and Norse mythology. Here, the flood myth takes on an incredibly fascinating twist, one that perfectly matches their harsh environment. In Norse mythology, the universe did not start with a peaceful garden. It started with violence. The gods, led by Odin, fought and killed an impossibly huge, primordial frost giant named Ymir. Now, picture this. Ymir is a giant made of frost and ice. When the gods kill him, his body melts. The ancient Norse texts describe an unimaginably massive flood of Ymir's blood bursting forth. The torrent was so sudden and massive that it drowned almost the entire race of frost giants. Only one giant, a man named Bergelmir, managed to survive with his wife. How did they survive? They climbed inside a hollowed-out tree trunk, known as a lure, and used it as a boat to ride out the catastrophic tidal wave of blood. I want you to pause and really think about the Norse story for a second. We don't need a PhD in archaeology to decode this. Think about the metaphor. A giant made of ice is destroyed, and his body suddenly turns into a massive, world-ending flood of liquid that drowns the ancient lands. Doesn't that sound exactly like an ancient, poetic way of describing a massive, sudden melting of a giant glacier? Keep that thought in your mind, because when we get to the scientific evidence in the next part of our journey, the blood of the frost giant is going to make terrifying, perfect sense. Finally, we cannot talk about the collective memory of humanity without visiting the very cradle of our species, Africa. From the sweeping savannas of the East to the deep forests of the West, oral traditions have carried the history of African tribes for millennia. Because these stories are passed down through spoken word rather than written stone tablets, they are incredibly diverse, yet they still hold that familiar watery echo. Take the Maasai people of East Africa, for example. Their legends speak of a righteous man named Tumbenot. The world had become heavily populated, but the people forgot their duties and stopped caring for one another. The supreme god, Enkai, decided to destroy the world with a great flood. Enkai commanded Tumbenot to build a great ark of wood, to gather his wives, and to take 2 of every kind of animal on board. The rain fell heavily, drowning everything outside the boat. When it finally stopped, Tumbenot sent out a dove to find dry land, and eventually they stepped out into a washed, renewed world. If we travel to West Africa, the Yoruba people tell stories of the great sea goddess Olokun. In their ancient myths, Olokun became furious with humanity and the other gods for taking away her lands. In a fit of rage, she summoned the oceans to rise up and swallow the continents. Massive tidal waves crashed over the land, drowning millions until another god, Obatala, had to intervene and force the waters back into their basins to save the remnants of humanity. So, what are we supposed to do with all this information? Let us zoom out and look at the big picture. We have traveled to ancient Iraq, India, China, the American Southwest, Mexico, Peru, Greece, Scandinavia, and Africa. We have heard stories of angry gods, magical giant fish, engineering marvels, hollowed-out tree trunks, and wooden boxes. If it was just 1 or 2 cultures, we could shrug it off as a coincidence. If a civilization lives next to a river, it makes sense that they would invent a story about a bad river flood. But we are not talking about local river floods. We are talking about stories that specifically describe the entire world disappearing underwater. We are talking about a global collective trauma. Psychologists and anthropologists have debated this for decades. How did over 500 distinct cultures around the world all happen to invent the exact same nightmare? The statistical probability of this being a mere coincidence is basically 0. Human imagination is beautifully diverse. If we were just making up doomsday stories, one culture would say the world ended by fire, another by endless winter, another by monster attacks, and another by a plague of insects. But they don't. From the frozen north to the tropical south, humanity's oldest shared memory is the memory of rising, violent water. The consistency of these myths points to a shocking conclusion. They are not just campfire stories. They are eyewitness testimonies. They are the distorted, heavily dramatized news reports of our ancestors, passed down through the only method they had: storytelling. They are telling us that at some point in our deep, ancient past, the Earth went through an agonizing, violent transition. The water really did come. The world as they knew it really did drown. But if this really happened, where is the physical proof? Where are the scars on the Earth? To find out, we have to put down the books of mythology and pick up the tools of modern science. We have to look at what the ice, the rocks, and the oceans tell us about a specific, terrifying period in Earth's history, roughly 12,000 years ago. The end of the Ice Age was not a slow, peaceful thaw. It was an absolute catastrophe. So, we have traveled the globe, listening to the terrified whispers of our ancestors. We have seen how the ancient Mesopotamians, the Navajo, the Mayans, the Greeks, and the Chinese all shared the exact same horrifying memory of a world swallowed by water. But stories, no matter how widespread or powerful, are still just stories. If a global flood actually happened, it could not just leave a mark on human memory. It had to leave a massive, undeniable scar on the physical planet itself. To find that physical proof, we have to close our books of mythology, step out of the temples, and put on our scientific hats. We need to travel back in time, not through ancient texts, but through the rocks, the oceans, and the ice. We need to look at exactly what was happening to planet Earth about 12,000 years ago. And let me tell you, the scientific reality is far more violent and dramatic than any Hollywood movie could ever capture. First, we need to completely erase the map of the world as you know it today. The Earth you see on a globe right now, with its familiar continents, its beautiful blue oceans, and its warm tropical beaches, did not look like that at all. We are going back to the late Pleistocene epoch, right at the tail end of the last ice age. Imagine the Earth as a giant, incredibly cold freezer. Today, we have ice at the North and South poles, but during the Ice Age, that ice did not just stay at the top and bottom of the world, it crept down like a slow, crushing, freezing monster. Massive sheets of ice, known as glaciers, covered almost all of Canada, half of the United States, northern Europe, and huge chunks of Asia. When I say sheets of ice, I do not mean a slippery layer on your driveway after a winter storm. I mean towering walls of solid frozen water. If you were standing in what is today New York City or Chicago back then, you would not be looking up at skyscrapers. You would be buried underneath a crushing wall of solid ice that was up to 2 miles, that is over 3 kilometers, thick. Imagine looking up, and instead of the sky, there is just a solid ceiling of blue-white ice extending higher than the tallest building you have ever seen. That was the reality for half the northern hemisphere. Because so much of the Earth's water was trapped in these gargantuan ice cubes on land, the oceans were completely starved of water. Think of the Earth's oceans like a giant bathtub. If you take all the water out of the bathtub and freeze it into giant blocks sitting on the bathroom floor, the water level inside the tub is going to drop dramatically. During the peak of the Ice Age, global sea levels were roughly 400 feet, or about 120 meters, lower than they are today. That is the height of a 40-story building. Because the water level was so low, the shape of the continents was completely different. The map of the ancient world was wider, vastly more connected, and full of land that simply does not exist anymore. You could literally walk from modern-day France to Great Britain without getting your feet wet. The English Channel was just a dry valley with a river running through it. You could walk from modern-day Russia to Alaska across a massive grassy land bridge known as Beringia. Southeast Asia was not a collection of scattered islands like Indonesia and Malaysia are today. It was a single, colossal landmass called Sundaland. Australia was connected to New Guinea. And who was living on these vast, exposed coastlines? Our ancestors. By this time, anatomically modern humans, people who looked, thought, and felt exactly like you and me, had spread across the entire globe. They were highly skilled hunter-gatherers. They lived alongside incredible, terrifying animals known as the megafauna, woolly mammoths the size of school buses, saber-toothed cats with teeth like daggers, and giant ground sloths that could stand 20 feet tall. Naturally, most of these human tribes chose to live in the absolute best real estate available, the coastlines and river valleys. Why? Because the coasts provided endless food from the ocean, mild weather, and easy transportation. They built their camps, their early settlements, and their hunting grounds on lands that were hundreds of feet below, where our oceans lap against the shore today. For tens of thousands of years, this freezing, brutal, but stable world was the only reality humanity knew. But then, the Earth's climate started to change. Around 15,000 years ago, the planet began to warm up. Scientists call this the Bering-Alerud warming period, but you can just think of it as the Great Thaw. Slowly, the massive 2-mile-high glaciers started to melt. The grip of the Ice Age was loosening. Flowers began to bloom where there was once only frost. Forests started spreading north. The mammoths began to migrate. And for the human tribes, life probably felt like it was getting a little easier. The weather was nicer, food was more abundant, and everything seemed to be on a slow, steady path toward a warmer, more welcoming world. But then, the Earth threw a terrifying curveball. Imagine you are driving a car on a highway. You have been stuck in freezing, terrible traffic for hours, the Ice Age. Finally, the traffic clears, the sun comes out, and you hit the gas, smoothly accelerating down the road, the Great Thaw. Then, without warning, you smash your foot on the brakes. The car goes into a violent spin, and you crash head first into a brick wall of solid ice. That sudden, violent crash is exactly what happened to the Earth's climate about 12,800 years ago. Scientists call this terrifying period the Younger Dryas. It is a weird name, but its origin is actually incredibly simple. It is named after a tiny, tough little white flower called Dryas octopetala. This specific flower only grows in extremely cold, harsh Arctic environments. When scientists were digging through ancient layers of dirt in Europe, they noticed something bizarre. During the warm period, the pollen from this Arctic flower completely disappeared, which makes sense. It was too warm for it. But suddenly, right at the 12,800-year mark, the dirt is absolutely choked with the pollen of this freezing weather flower. It had suddenly bloomed everywhere, as far south as the Mediterranean. Why? Because the Earth had suddenly, violently frozen over again. The Younger Dryas was a climate shock of apocalyptic proportions. the beautiful, gradual warming completely stopped, and global temperatures plummeted back down to Ice Age levels. And here is the truly terrifying part. It did not happen slowly. For a long time, scientists assumed that massive climate shifts took millions, or at least tens of thousands, of years to happen. They thought the Earth was a massive, slow-moving machine. But when they started drilling deep into the ice of Greenland to pull up ice cores, which are basically long tubes of ancient frozen water that act like tree rings, trapping tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere, they discovered a horrifying truth. The ice cores proved that the temperature drop of the Younger Dryas did not take millennia. It happened in an instant in geological time. The climate went from warm and pleasant to a freezing, brutal nightmare in a matter of centuries, maybe decades, or, some scientists argue, within a single human lifetime. Imagine a winter that starts one November and just never, ever ends for the next 1,200 years. This extreme deep freeze locked the water back up in ice, pausing the sea level rise. But the mystery deepens. What caused this sudden, violent freeze? Why did the Earth's engine just stall out? Was it an ocean current shutting down? Was it a massive volcano blocking out the sun? Or was it something from outer space? We will explore those explosive theories in the next part. But the most important thing to know about the Younger Dryas is not just how it started. It is how it ended. The deep freeze lasted for roughly 1,200 brutal years. Humanity suffered. The megafauna began to die out in massive numbers, and the world was locked in a bitter struggle for survival. Then, around 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended. And it ended just as violently as it began. The temperatures did not just slowly creep back up. They spiked. The climate snapped out of the freeze like a stretched rubber band. The ice cores in Greenland show that global temperatures rocketed upward by as much as 18 degrees Fahrenheit, about 10 degrees Celsius, in just a few decades. That is a level of sudden, catastrophic global warming that makes our modern climate change look like a gentle spring breeze. I want you to really visualize this moment. Around 11,600 years ago, someone turned the oven on high. The Earth went from a deep frozen ice ball to a rapidly baking greenhouse almost overnight. Now, remember those 2-mile-high walls of solid ice covering half of the northern hemisphere? Remember the millions of cubic miles of frozen water sitting right above North America, Europe, and Asia? What happens when you take a mountain of ice and hit it with a massive, sudden blast of heat? It melts fast. The water could no longer stay frozen on the land. It had to go somewhere. The dams broke, the rivers overflowed, and unimaginable quantities of water rushed toward the seas. The giant bathtub of the oceans, which had been mostly empty for tens of thousands of years, was about to fill up at a terrifying, catastrophic speed. The age of the Great Freeze was over. The age of the Great Flood was about to begin. When we talk about the ice melting at the end of the Younger Dryas, roughly 11,600 years ago, it is crucial to understand that this was not a gentle, peaceful springtime thaw. You might be imagining a snowman slowly melting in your front yard, dripping water drop by drop until it is just a puddle. That is not what happened to the Earth. When global temperatures spiked by up to 18 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of decades, the 2-mile-high glaciers covering the northern hemisphere did not just drip. They collapsed, they shattered, they liquefied. Scientists have a very specific, slightly terrifying term for what happened next: meltwater pulses. Imagine you have a massive inflatable swimming pool in your backyard, filled to the brim. Now, instead of slowly draining the water out with a hose, you take a machete and slash a massive hole in the side of the pool. The water does not trickle. It violently rushes out in a catastrophic wave, completely flooding your lawn in seconds. That is a meltwater pulse. As the colossal ice sheets over North America and Europe destabilized, massive ice dams that held back lakes the size of modern countries suddenly ruptured. Millions of cubic miles of freezing freshwater were violently dumped straight into the global oceans. The ocean levels did not rise by a few inches a century, the way they are slowly creeping up today. During the most extreme periods, such as Meltwater Pulse 1A and 1B, sea levels were surging upward at a terrifying rate. Over the course of this chaotic transition, global sea levels rose by an astonishing 400 feet, or about 120 meters. Let us put that into a perspective we can easily visualize. Imagine the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. From the ground to the tip of her torch, she is 305 feet tall. The rising oceans at the end of the Ice Age would have completely swallowed the Statue of Liberty, with nearly 100 feet of dark ocean water rolling over the very top of her golden flame. If you live in a coastal city today, whether it is Miami, London, Tokyo, or Sydney, your entire world would be deep underwater. But for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, the rising oceans did not just flood cities. They completely erased entire land masses from the map. They drowned whole continents. Let us take a tour of the lost worlds of the Ice Age, the real-life Atlantises that were swallowed by the sea, starting with Europe. Right now, if you want to travel from the United Kingdom to France or the Netherlands, you have to take a boat across the North Sea or ride a train through the underwater Channel Tunnel. But 12,000 years ago, there was no North Sea. There was a massive, incredibly fertile continent known as Doggerland. Doggerland was the true heart of ancient Europe. It was a sprawling expanse of rolling hills, lush marshlands, thick forests, and meandering rivers. It connected the British Isles entirely to mainland Europe. For thousands of years, this was an absolute paradise for early humans. Archaeologists frequently pull up terrifying and amazing artifacts from the bottom of the North Sea in the nets of modern fishing boats. The massive curved tusks of woolly mammoths, the remains of extinct cave lions, and exquisitely crafted human tools made of bone and stone. The people living in Doggerland had no idea they were living on borrowed time. As the great glaciers melted, the water began to encroach on their paradise. At first, it might have seemed like the rivers were just running a bit higher every spring. Then, the marshlands started getting saltier. Over generations, the coastline crept further and further inland, forcing tribes to constantly pack up their camps and retreat to higher ground. The massive continent of Doggerland was slowly being choked by the rising sea, turning into a shrinking island. But the final blow for Doggerland was not a slow flood. It was a sudden, violent apocalypse. Around 8,200 years ago, the melting ice caused a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide. A chunk of the ocean floor the size of Scotland suddenly collapsed. This displaced billions of tons of water, triggering an apocalyptic mega-tsunami. Imagine being a hunter-gatherer standing on the remaining shores of Doggerland. First, you would feel the ground violently shake. Then, the ocean would suddenly suck backward, exposing miles of the sea floor. Finally, you would look at the horizon and see a wall of water up to 60 feet tall rushing toward you at the speed of a jet airplane. The Storegga tsunami swept entirely over whatever was left of Doggerland, violently drowning every living creature in its path. When the waters finally settled, the heart of Europe was gone forever, buried beneath the cold, gray waves of the North Sea. The surviving humans who had managed to run up into the hills of modern-day Britain and France were now permanently separated by an impassable ocean. Now, let us leave the freezing waters of Europe and travel halfway across the globe to the tropical, steamy equator. If we look at a modern map of Southeast Asia, we see the mainland, countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia, and then thousands of scattered islands that make up Indonesia and the Philippines. But 12,000 years ago, there were almost no islands here. This entire region was one gigantic, solid, continuous landmass known as Sundaland. Sundaland was absolutely colossal. It was an ancient continent twice the size of modern India. You could walk out of the jungles of modern-day Vietnam and keep walking perfectly dry-shod all the way to the beaches of Bali or the deep rainforests of Borneo. It was a tropical Eden. Because it was located right on the equator, it was untouched by the freezing ice sheets that terrorized the north. Sundaland was blanketed in immense, dense rainforests, cut through by massive river systems and populated by rhinos, tigers, orangutans, and massive populations of humans. Because the climate was so stable and the food was so abundant, scientists believe Sundaland was a major incubator for human civilization. It was a bustling hub of ancient humanity. But then, the Meltwater Pulses hit. The flooding of Sundaland was a masterclass in geographical torture. Because the land was incredibly flat, even a slight rise in sea level meant the ocean would rush miles inland. Imagine living in a fertile river valley that your family had hunted in for hundreds of generations. Within your own lifetime, the salt water pushes up the river. The trees begin to rot and die from the salt. The animals flee. Then, the ocean crests over the riverbanks and simply takes the valley. As the oceans rose by 400 feet, the water violently poured into the lowlands of Sundaland. It drowned the great plains, swallowed the ancient river valleys, and choked the forests. The highest mountain peaks of this ancient continent were all that remained above the water. Today, we call those flooded mountain peaks the islands of Indonesia. Millions of people were displaced. Where did they go? They had no choice but to build boats and become masters of the sea. Or they were forced to flee northward into mainland Asia, pushing into territories already occupied by other tribes, likely causing massive conflicts and wars over the shrinking dry land. Is it any wonder that the people of Asia have such deeply ingrained, terrifying legends of a great flood? The survivors of Sundaland were the ultimate climate refugees, carrying the traumatic memory of their drowned homeland to every corner of the Eastern Hemisphere. Finally, we must look at the most crucial missing piece of the map, the land that connected the Old World to the New World. Beringia. Today, the Bering Strait is a narrow, freezing, stormy stretch of ocean that separates the easternmost tip of Russia from the westernmost tip of Alaska. But during the Ice Age, the ocean levels were so low that the sea floor here was completely exposed. And it was not just a tiny, narrow, precarious rope bridge. Beringia was a massive, sprawling subcontinent over 600 miles wide. It was a dry, freezing, wind-swept grassland known as the Mammoth Steppe. This vanished land was the ultimate highway for humanity. It was across this vast, grassy plain that the first human beings followed herds of giant bison, caribou, and mammoths out of Asia and stepped foot into the Americas. For thousands of years, Beringia was not just a bridge. It was a home. Human tribes lived, hunted, and died on this landmass. But as the ice melted and the oceans rose, the jaws of the Pacific and Arctic oceans slowly began to close. The water crept over the grassy plains. The massive herds of animals were cut off, and the human tribes were forced to make a permanent choice: retreat back into the frozen expanse of Siberia, or push forward into the unknown, uncharted wilderness of North America. Around 10,000 years ago, the oceans finally met, swallowing Beringia entirely. The land bridge was gone. The door slammed shut. The oceans had risen to their modern levels, effectively cutting off the native peoples of the Americas from the rest of the human race for the next 10 millennia, until the arrival of European explorers. So, let us look at the terrifying reality of the Meltwater Pulses. In a geological blink of an eye, the Earth's oceans swallowed millions of square miles of the most fertile, habitable land on the planet. Doggerland in Europe, gone. Sundaland in Asia, gone. Beringia in the Arctic, gone. Coastal plains in India, South America, and Africa, gone. Every single human being alive 12,000 years ago had to deal with the wrath of the rising water. It was not a localized disaster. It was a global apocalypse. Families watched their ancestral hunting grounds disappear beneath the waves. Entire tribes were wiped out by sudden tsunamis caused by collapsing ice sheets. Those who survived were the ones who managed to scramble up the mountains, the ones who learned to build boats, the ones who were warned in time. Science completely validates the ancient myths. The Great Flood was not a fairy tale. It was the brutal, watery birth of the modern world. But this brings us to a massive, burning question. We know the ice melted. We know the oceans rose violently. We know the ancient continents drowned. But why? What could possibly cause a massive, global ice age to suddenly stop, plummet back into a 1,200-year deep freeze during the Younger Dryas, and then violently snap into a rapid global warming phase? What kind of unimaginable energy could trigger such a planetary roller coaster? Was it just a random fluctuation in the Earth's orbit? Or was the Earth hit by something? To find the answer to what triggered the Great Flood, we have to look up from the bottom of the ocean and stare out into the cold, dark, and dangerous void of deep space. We have established the terrifying reality on the ground. The ice melted, the oceans violently rose, and the ancient continents drowned. But this brings us to the ultimate mystery of our journey. What exactly was the trigger? The Earth is a massive, slow-moving system. It takes an unimaginable amount of energy to suddenly plunge a warming planet back into a brutal 1,200-year ice age, the Younger Dryas, and then just as violently snap it out of the freeze, causing the catastrophic meltwater pulses. For decades, mainstream science was stumped. Some researchers suggested that the Earth simply went through a weird orbital wobble. Others thought maybe a massive volcano erupted, blocking out the sun with ash. But neither of these theories fully explained the suddenness, the sheer violence, or the very specific physical evidence left behind in the dirt. To find the true culprit, a growing number of scientists realized they had to look up. They had to look into the dark, freezing void of outer space. Welcome to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It is one of the most controversial, intensely debated, and terrifying scientific theories of the 21st century. And it reads exactly like the script of a blockbuster disaster movie. To understand this hypothesis, we first need to understand our solar system. Space is not completely empty. It is filled with debris, asteroids and comets left over from the creation of the planets. An asteroid is essentially a giant flying rock, while a comet is more like a massive, dirty snowball made of ice, dust, and frozen gases. Occasionally, a massive comet gets bumped out of its orbit in the deep, outer solar system and begins a long, terrifying dive toward the sun. As it gets closer to the sun's heat, the comet begins to boil, leaving behind a massive trail of debris. But here is the most important part. Comets are fragile. The gravitational pull of the sun and the planets can tear them apart. Instead of a single, solid bowling ball hurtling through space, a fragmented comet turns into a cosmic shotgun blast. We actually saw this happen in our own lifetimes. In 1994, a comet named Shoemaker-Levy 9 broke apart into a string of pearls, a line of over 20 massive fragments, and smashed into the planet Jupiter, leaving explosive scars on the gas giant that were larger than the entire planet Earth. Now, let us travel back to exactly 12,800 years ago. The Earth is slowly warming. The great mammoths are roaming North America. Human tribes known as the Clovis people are hunting on the Great Plains. Suddenly, a new light appears in the sky. It is not the moon or the sun. It is a fragmented comet, perhaps part of the torrid meteor stream, heading directly for a collision course with Earth. The ancestors of the Native Americans would have looked up to see the sky quite literally on fire as dozens of massive, glowing fragments screamed into the atmosphere at 70,000 miles per hour. But these fragments did not strike the deep ocean, and they did not strike bare rock. They struck North America and parts of northern Europe. At that exact moment, North America was covered by the Laurentide ice sheet, a solid wall of glacier ice over 2 miles thick. What happens when a massive cosmic bullet hits a 2-mile-thick shield of solid ice? The physics are absolutely apocalyptic. When a comet fragment hits the atmosphere, it pushes the air in front of it so hard and so fast that the air physically cannot get out of the way. The friction superheats the air to temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. When that superheated fragment finally impacts the ice sheet, the kinetic energy is converted into a spectacular, unimaginable explosion. We are talking about an impact equivalent to millions of nuclear bombs detonating at the exact same fraction of a second. The ice did not just melt, it instantly vaporized. The explosion punched a hole straight through the 2-mile-thick glacier, sending a massive shockwave across the continent. The heat was so intense that the surrounding forests covering North America instantaneously burst into flames. The sky turned completely black as millions of tons of vaporized steam, pulverized ice, smoke from the burning continent, and cosmic dust were blasted into the upper atmosphere. This is the ultimate nuclear winter scenario. The smoke and vapor wrapped around the northern hemisphere, completely blocking out the warmth of the sun. At the same time, the sudden, violent melting of the ice sheet dumped billions of gallons of freezing fresh water into the North Atlantic Ocean. This massive flood of fresh water was so heavy that it completely jammed the ocean conveyor belt, the warm water currents that keep the northern hemisphere temperate. With the sun blocked and the warm ocean currents shut down, the Earth's climate engine stalled. In a matter of weeks or months, the pleasant, warming world slammed back into a deep, dark freeze. This is how the 1,200-year nightmare of the Younger Dryas began. Now, you might be asking, this sounds terrifying, but where is the proof? If a comet hit the Earth, wouldn't it leave a giant hole in the ground? That was exactly the question skeptics asked for years. But if you shoot a bullet into a giant block of ice, the ice shatters and melts. You are left with a puddle, not a crater. The Laurentide ice sheet acted as a massive temporary shield. The crater was carved into the ice, and when the ice eventually melted away thousands of years later, the crater simply vanished. But the impact did leave behind a crime scene. And it is a crime scene that you can still see today if you know where to dig. All across North America, Europe, and parts of the Middle East, archaeologists digging into the earth kept finding something incredibly strange. They would dig down through the layers of dirt, going back in time. 10,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago, and then, right at the 12,800-year mark, they hit a solid, distinct, black line in the soil. Scientists call this the black mat, or the Younger Dryas boundary layer. It is an actual physical line of black ash and soot. It is the charred remains of a burning world. When you look at the dirt directly below this black mat, you find the bones of woolly mammoths, giant sloths, and the beautiful stone spear points of the human Clovis culture. It is a world teeming with life. But when you look at the dirt directly above the black mat, there is nothing. The megafauna are completely gone. The Clovis people vanish from the archaeological record. The black mat is a layer of mass extinction. But the real smoking gun was found when scientists took dirt from this black mat and put it under high-powered electron microscopes. They were looking for the microscopic fingerprints of a cosmic impact, and they found a terrifying amount of evidence. First, they found nanodiamonds. What is a nanodiamond? Well, you know that diamonds are created when carbon is put under immense crushing pressure and extreme heat over millions of years deep inside the earth. But you can also create a diamond in a fraction of a second if you hit carbon with an explosion so powerful it defies comprehension. A comet slamming into the Earth at 70,000 miles per hour provides exactly that kind of pressure. The black mat is loaded with millions of these microscopic, shock-created diamonds. Second, they found magnetic spherules. These are tiny, perfectly round, microscopic balls of iron. How do they form? When a rock from space explodes, the iron inside it is vaporized into a hot gas. As that gas cools in the air, it condenses into tiny liquid metal droplets, which freeze into perfect little spheres before they hit the ground. Finding magnetic spherules in the dirt is like finding the spent shell casings at a crime scene. Finally, the most horrifying piece of evidence: melt glass. Under the microscope, scientists found tiny chunks of sand and soil that had been completely melted into glass. To melt sand into glass, you need temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius, over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. A forest fire cannot get that hot. The hottest magma from a volcano cannot get that hot. Do you know where else we find this exact type of melt glass? We find it at the Trinity test site in New Mexico, where the United States detonated the very first atomic bomb. The heat from the nuclear blast melted the desert sand into green glass. The fact that we find this identical nuclear-grade melt glass scattered across multiple continents right at the 12,800-year mark proves that the Earth was subjected to heat flashes of unimaginable cosmic intensity. For years, the evidence was microscopic. But recently, the skeptics who demanded a giant hole in the ground finally got their wish. In 2018, scientists flying specialized radar planes over the frozen wasteland of northern Greenland looked through a mile of solid ice and found something that made their jaws drop. Hidden perfectly beneath the Hiawatha Glacier was a massive, perfectly circular depression. It is the Hiawatha Crater. The crater is 19 miles, 31 kilometers wide. To make a hole that big, the iron asteroid or comet fragment that hit it must have been over half a mile wide. While scientists are still debating the exact age of the Hiawatha Crater, its incredibly fresh, uneroded rim strongly suggests it is remarkably young in geological terms. It is the exact kind of massive, ice-shattering impact wound the Younger Dryas theory predicted. So, we have the motive, the weapon, and the crime scene. A fragmented comet strikes the ice sheets of North America and Europe. The violent impact vaporizes the ice, sets the continents on fire, and chokes the sky with black smoke. The massive influx of freezing freshwater shuts down the ocean currents, plunging the Earth back into a 1,200-year deep freeze. The climate is completely destabilized. But a freezing planet does not cause a global flood. It just builds the tension. It stores millions of cubic miles of water on land in the form of towering, unstable glaciers. When the Younger Dryas finally ended 1,200 years later, whether caused by the atmosphere finally clearing, another cosmic impact, or massive volcanic activity releasing greenhouse gases, the temperature violently spiked. The tension snapped. The 2-mile-high walls of ice could no longer hold. And as those massive ice dams collapsed, the true horror of the Great Flood was finally unleashed upon the human race. The water did not just rise gently, it tore the continents apart. So, the 1,200-year deep freeze of the Younger Dryas has just violently ended. Global temperatures have skyrocketed. We have 2-mile-high walls of solid ice covering half of the northern hemisphere. And suddenly, somebody turns the planetary thermostat up to maximum. What exactly does that look like on the ground? To understand the true horror of the Great Flood, we have to stop thinking about rain. Yes, ancient myths talk about 40 days and 40 nights of rain, and a rapidly warming atmosphere certainly would have caused massive, global superstorms. But rain alone does not drown continents. To get the kind of apocalyptic devastation described in our collective human memory, the water has to come from the Earth itself. It has to come from the collapse of the ice. Imagine you are standing at the foot of a massive glacier. Today, glaciers are relatively small, slow-moving rivers of ice hidden in mountain valleys. But 11,600 years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America was a solid, unbroken cliff of ice, towering thousands of feet into the sky, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. As the intense heat of the sudden global warming hit this ice sheet, it began to melt at a terrifying rate. But the water did not just flow nicely into the ocean. The geography of the land had been pushed down and warped by the immense weight of the ice over tens of thousands of years, creating massive, bowl-shaped depressions in the earth. As the ice melted, these gigantic bowls began to fill with freezing, milky white fresh water. Because the ice sheet was still blocking the path to the sea, it acted as a colossal, temporary dam. This created what scientists call proglacial lakes, or glacial lakes. And the most terrifying of them all was located right in the heart of North America. Glacial Lake Agassiz. Forget everything you know about normal lakes. Lake Agassiz was not a place to go fishing or swimming. It was a ticking time bomb. At its peak, this single freshwater lake was larger than the state of California. It held more water than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. It was a vast, inland freshwater sea held back by a fragile, melting wall of ice. Now, imagine the physics of this situation. Water is incredibly heavy. A single cubic meter of water weighs exactly 1 metric ton. Lake Agassiz contained thousands of cubic kilometers of water, relentlessly pressing against a dam made entirely of cracking, rotting, melting ice. Eventually, the pressure became too great. The water found a weak point in the ice wall. It might have started as a trickle, then a crack, and then, with a deafening roar that would have shaken the continent, the ice dam catastrophically failed. When a glacial lake of this magnitude bursts, scientists call it a glacial lake outburst flood, or a megaflood. But even megaflood does not do it justice. The water inside Lake Agassiz did not just spill. It exploded outward. Millions of cubic meters of water per second surged across the North American continent. The floodwaters were hundreds of feet deep, traveling at highway speeds. But this was not clear, clean water. It was a churning, violent, black slurry of mud, pulverized rock, entire forests that had been ripped out by the roots, and massive chunks of ice the size of skyscrapers that had broken off from the collapsing dam. To give you an idea of the unbelievable destructive power of these megafloods, we just have to look at the landscape of the Pacific Northwest in the United States, specifically an area in Washington state known as the Channeled Scablands. When early geologists first visited the Scablands, they were completely confused. The entire landscape looked as if a giant had taken a massive wire brush and scraped away all the topsoil, leaving behind deeply scarred, gouged bedrock. They found massive, multi-ton boulders sitting in the middle of flat plains, hundreds of miles away from the mountains they originally came from. They even found giant ripple marks in the earth, exactly like the tiny ripples you see in the sand at the beach when the tide goes out, except these ripples were 50 feet high and spaced hundreds of feet apart. For decades, the scientific community insisted that rivers over millions of years slowly carved this landscape. But one geologist, J. Harlan Bretz, looked at the Scablands and realized the terrifying truth. This was not the work of millions of years of gentle erosion. This was the work of a few days of absolute hell. The Scablands were carved by the repeated bursting of Glacial Lake Missoula, another massive ice-dammed lake. When its ice dam broke, a towering wall of water ripped across the state of Washington, moving at 80 miles per hour, completely stripping the flesh off the continent down to the bare rock. The water gouged out canyons, created massive dry waterfalls that dwarf Niagara Falls, and dumped millions of tons of debris into the Pacific Ocean. Now, multiply the terror of the Missoula floods by 10, and you have the bursting of Lake Agassiz. The Agassiz floodwaters ripped eastward, tearing through the St. Lawrence River Valley, and violently dumped billions of tons of freezing fresh water directly into the Atlantic Ocean. If any human tribes were living in the path of these megafloods, they had absolutely zero chance of survival. There was no time to run. There was no time to climb a tree. The ground would have begun to shake violently. A roaring sound louder than 1,000 freight trains would have filled the air. And then a wall of black, freezing water, choked with ice and crushed trees, would have simply erased them from existence. This nightmare scenario was not just happening in North America. Similar, massive glacial lakes were bursting all over the world. In the Andes of South America, in the Himalayas of Asia, and in the Alps of Europe, warming temperatures caused ice dams to shatter, sending apocalyptic walls of water roaring down mountain valleys, wiping out everything in their path. This is why so many ancient flood myths, like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the biblical story of Noah, specifically state that the fountains of the great deep burst forth. The ancients were not just describing heavy rain, they were describing the earth itself, violently rupturing and vomiting oceans of water over the land. But the horror did not stop inland. If you managed to survive the megafloods tearing across the continents, you were not safe. Because when billions of tons of glacial meltwater and massive chunks of continental ice are violently dumped into the oceans, they trigger a completely different type of monster, the mega tsunami. We are all familiar with regular tsunamis. They are usually caused by massive underwater earthquakes, like the tragic 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami or the 2011 tsunami in Japan. An earthquake shifts the ocean floor by a few feet, displacing a large amount of water, which travels across the ocean and piles up on the coast. These are incredibly destructive, but their wave heights are generally limited. A mega tsunami is a completely different beast, created by a completely different mechanism. To understand a mega tsunami, imagine you have a bathtub filled with calm water. If you tap the bottom of the tub from the outside, you create a small ripple. That is an earthquake tsunami. But what happens if you take a massive, heavy bowling ball and violently drop it directly into the bathtub? The water does not just ripple, it violently splashes outward in a massive, chaotic wave that spills all over your bathroom floor. That bowling ball is a collapsing glacier. As the ice sheets destabilized at the end of the Younger Dryas, massive chunks of ice, some the size of small cities, fractured and plummeted into the freezing oceans. Furthermore, the rapid melting of the ice removed unimaginable weight from the continents, causing the Earth's crust to bounce back up, a process known as isostatic rebound. This rapid shifting of the Earth's crust triggered colossal underwater landslides. We talked briefly about the Storegga slide in Europe, which wiped out Doggerland. When a chunk of the ocean floor the size of Scotland suddenly collapsed, it displaced an amount of water that is almost impossible to comprehend. The resulting mega tsunamis did not just hit the beaches, they climbed mountains. When a regular tsunami hits the shore, it might reach 30 or 40 feet high. But when a mega tsunami caused by a massive coastal collapse or a giant iceberg drop reaches the shallow water of the coast, it piles up into a towering wall of destruction that can reach hundreds or even over 1,000 feet high. Imagine being an ancient hunter-gatherer living on the coast of what is now Norway, or the Pacific coast of South America, or the shores of Southeast Asia. You have built your life around the predictable rhythms of the sea, but one day, the ocean suddenly does something impossible. It violently sucks backward. The water retreats for miles, exposing the bare, muddy sea floor, leaving fish flapping in the air. An eerie, terrifying silence falls over the coastline, and then you look at the horizon. The sky is blocked out. A wall of dark, churning water, taller than the highest hills, is rushing towards the shore at the speed of a jet airliner. When a mega tsunami strikes, it does not just flood the land, it scours it. The immense kinetic energy of a wave that high completely destroys everything. It rips giant boulders out of the earth, snaps massive trees like twigs, and completely annihilates any human settlement unlucky enough to be in its path. This combination, the sudden, violent bursting of inland glacial lakes tearing the continents apart from the inside and the colossal mega-tsunamis hammering the coastlines from the outside, created a literal hell on Earth. It was a multi-front war waged by water. Whether you lived in the deep valleys of the mountains or on the sunny beaches of the coast, the water came for you. The melting of the Ice Age was not a peaceful transition. It was a planetary demolition derby. When we look at the physical evidence, the violently scarred scablands of North America, the massive underwater landslide debris of the Storegga Slide, the ancient, submerged coastlines of Doggerland and Sundaland, we realize that the ancient myths were not exaggerating. If anything, they were understating the sheer, unimaginable violence of the event. The story of Noah, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the legends of Manu and Deucalion, these are the desperate, traumatized accounts of the few people who were high enough, far enough inland, or lucky enough to have a boat when the world was quite literally ripped apart by water. But if these ancient humans actually survived a global catastrophe of this magnitude, did they leave anything else behind besides stories? Did they build anything to warn future generations or to remember the world that was lost? To find out, we have to look for the ultimate proof, the physical ruins of the civilizations that watched the waters rise. We must dive to the bottom of the ocean and dig into the highest mountains to find the lost cities of the Ice Age. If the catastrophic meltwater pulses truly happened, if the oceans violently rose by 400 feet and swallowed ancient continents like Doggerland, Sundaland, and Beringia, a massive question remains. Where is the human evidence? If millions of people were displaced, and if early human civilizations were building their lives on those lush, ancient coastlines, shouldn't we be able to find their ruined cities sitting at the bottom of the sea? The short answer is yes. But the practical reality of marine archaeology is a nightmare. To understand why it is so incredibly difficult to find a 12,000-year-old flooded city, you have to understand how destructive the ocean truly is. The sea is not a gentle museum display case. It is a giant, chaotic washing machine. When the oceans rose during the end of the Ice Age, the water did not just politely cover human settlements. The mega-tsunamis and raging floodwaters smashed wooden structures to splinters. Over the next 10 millennia, relentless ocean currents, highly corrosive salt water, and thousands of massive hurricanes ground whatever was left into dust. On top of the physical destruction, the ocean is an absolute master of hiding things. Over 10,000 years, millions of tons of sand, silt, and dead coral have rained down onto the ocean floor, completely burying anything that managed to survive the initial violent flooding. Today, We have better maps of the surface of Mars and the Moon than we do of our own ocean floor. Searching for a drowned Ice Age settlement is not like looking for a needle in a haystack. It is like looking for a specific grain of sand in the Sahara Desert, completely in the dark, while holding your breath. But despite these impossible odds, human curiosity is a powerful thing. In the last few decades, as underwater technology like side-scan, sonar, and deep-sea submersibles has advanced, intrepid explorers have started peering into the deep, and what they are finding off the coasts of our modern continents is sending shockwaves through the historical community. We are beginning to uncover massive, inexplicable anomalies sitting perfectly in the drowning zones of the Ice Age. Let us start our underwater treasure hunt off the coast of Japan, near a tiny, remote landmass called Yonaguni Island. In the winter of 1986, a local dive tour operator named Kihachiro Aratake was exploring the completely uncharted waters off the southern coast of Yonaguni. He was not looking for ancient history. He was looking for a good spot to take tourists to see hammerhead sharks. The water here is incredibly dangerous, battered by strong, sweeping currents. As Aratake swam deeper, fighting the drag of the ocean, the murky blue water suddenly gave way to something that stopped his heart. Looming out of the deep ocean shadows, completely covered in a thin layer of marine growth, was a colossal stone structure. It did not look like a coral reef. It did not look like a random pile of rocks. It looked exactly like a massive drowned pyramid. Aratake had discovered what is now known worldwide as the Yonaguni Monument. When photographs of the structure finally reached the surface, the archaeological world erupted into a fierce, passionate debate. The monument is absolutely massive, measuring over 160 feet long and 65 feet wide. But it is the shape of the rock that makes it so incredibly mind-boggling. If you dive down to Yonaguni today, you will not see rough, jagged, random sea rocks. You will see what appear to be massive, perfectly flat terraces. You will see enormous, perfectly straight steps, each one several feet high, completely flat on top, as if carved for giants. There are deep, perfectly straight trenches that look like ancient roadways. There is a massive, flat area that divers call the stage, a deep, triangular pool, and even a massive stone carved into what looks remarkably like the face of a giant turtle. There are right angles, sharp corners, and parallel lines everywhere. For a marine geologist named Dr. Masaki Kimura, who has spent decades diving at the site, the conclusion was obvious. He argued that the Yonaguni Monument was undeniably the work of human hands. He pointed out what looked like tool marks, ancient retaining walls, and even primitive carvings. According to Kimura, this was a magnificent, terraced city, a temple complex built by an ancient, lost Japanese civilization. And here is the most compelling piece of his argument: the location and the timeline. Remember the Meltwater Pulses? 12,000 years ago, during the Ice Age, the sea level was 400 feet lower. At that exact time, the Yonaguni Monument was not underwater. It was sitting high and dry on a massive, lush peninsula connected to the Asian mainland. It was prime real estate. But when the great glaciers melted, the water rose, and this coastal plain was violently swallowed by the sea, dragging the monument down into the dark. However, the scientific community is highly skeptical, and for very good reason. To claim that a civilization was carving massive stone monuments 12,000 years ago completely breaks the accepted timeline of human history. Mainstream history says that 12,000 years ago, we were just primitive hunter-gatherers living in caves, entirely incapable of moving or carving massive stone blocks. Enter Dr. Robert Schoch, a highly respected geologist who traveled to Japan to study the monument firsthand. Schoch looked at the perfect right angles and the flat steps and came to a totally different but equally fascinating conclusion. He argued that Yonaguni is an incredible, beautiful trick of Mother Nature. How can nature create perfect right angles? Schoch explained that the monument is made of a specific type of sedimentary rock called sandstone. Sandstone is laid down in perfectly flat layers over millions of years. When this type of rock is pushed up by violent earthquakes, which Japan has plenty of, it tends to fracture and break along exactly flat, parallel lines, known as cleavage planes. Think of it like slicing a perfectly layered cake or dropping a giant block of dry, brittle clay. It doesn't shatter into jagged little spheres. It breaks off in massive, flat, geometric chunks. The incredibly strong ocean currents at Yonaguni then act like a giant broom, sweeping away the loose, broken blocks, leaving behind what perfectly mimics a carved, stepped pyramid. So who is right? Is it an ancient, drowned temple, or just a really weird rock? The truth might actually be somewhere in the middle, in a concept called terraforming. Even if Mother Nature created the basic, blocky shape of the Yonaguni Monument through natural geological fracturing, it is entirely possible, and highly likely, that ancient humans living on that coast 12,000 years ago found this massive, perfectly flat rock formation and used it. They might have modified it, widening the steps, clearing the debris, and turning a natural geological wonder into a sacred coastal temple. When the Great Flood came, they were forced to abandon it to the waves. Whether Yonaguni is completely man-made, totally natural, or a mixture of both, it forces us to confront the reality of the drowned coastlines. It sits exactly where our ancient ancestors would have lived, right before the water took their world away. But if Yonaguni leaves room for natural doubt, our next stop leaves almost none. We are going to leave the deep, clear waters of Japan and travel west to the incredibly chaotic, muddy, and myth-soaked waters of India. For thousands of years, the ancient Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, has told the story of Dwarka. According to the sacred texts, Dwarka was a magnificent, glittering city made of gold, silver, and precious stones. It was the legendary kingdom of Lord Krishna, one of the most revered and powerful deities in Hinduism. The texts describe a massive, heavily fortified coastal metropolis filled with grand palaces, bustling markets, and advanced architecture. But the Mahabharata also tells a tragic story of Dwarka's end. The epic states that exactly 7 days after Lord Krishna left this earthly realm, the Arabian Sea rose up in a terrible fury. A massive, catastrophic wave crashed over the Golden City, swallowing it whole and pulling the entire kingdom down into the dark depths of the ocean. For generations, modern historians and archaeologists treated the story of Dwarka exactly how they treated the story of Noah's Ark or the Epic of Gilgamesh. They smiled, called it a beautiful, poetic fairy tale, and insisted that no such golden city ever existed. It was just a myth. Then, the year 2001 arrived, and the fairy tale violently collided with modern science. The National Institute of Ocean Technology, NIOT, in India, was conducting a completely routine boring survey in the Gulf of Kambat, off the western coast of India. They were not looking for ancient cities. They were just measuring water pollution levels. The water in the Gulf of Kambat is notoriously treacherous. It is incredibly murky, filled with dark, swirling sediment, and ripped apart by some of the strongest tidal currents on the planet. You cannot see your own hand in front of your face underwater there. Because diving was practically impossible, the scientists were dragging side-scan sonar equipment behind their boat. Sonar sends sound waves down to the ocean floor. When the sound hits something, it bounces back, creating a topographic map of the bottom. As the scientists watched the sonar monitors aboard their ship, the boring, flat, muddy ocean floor suddenly disappeared. The screens lit up with massive, highly unnatural shapes. Lying 120 feet, about 36 meters, beneath the crashing muddy waves, the sonar revealed an enormous, sprawling underwater city. The scans showed massive geometric structures laid out in a perfect grid pattern, stretching for over 5 miles. They saw what looked like the foundational walls of huge buildings, perfectly straight streets, and even the distinct, winding paths of ancient river channels that had long since been swallowed by the sea. The scientific community in India was absolutely stunned. They immediately launched massive dredging operations, dropping heavy buckets down into the dark, swirling mud to see what they could pull up from the anomaly. When they dumped the mud onto the deck of the ship, the myth of Dwarka became a tangible, physical reality. Out of the muck came perfectly carved stone blocks, sections of ancient walls, pieces of beautifully crafted pottery, semi-precious stones, and human bones. But the most important thing they pulled out of the dark water was a single, waterlogged piece of wood. It was part of a timber structure, perhaps a beam from a house or a massive door. Because it was organic material, scientists could do something to it that they cannot do to stone. They could carbon date it. They sent the wood to prestigious laboratories around the world, completely blind, asking for a date. When the results came back, it sent a shockwave through the archaeological establishment. The piece of wood from the drowned city in the Gulf of Cambay was absolutely ancient. It dated back to roughly 9,500 years ago. Let that sink in for a moment. 9,500 years ago perfectly aligns with the turbulent, chaotic centuries immediately following the end of the Ice Age and the massive meltwater pulses. It proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that ancient humans were building massive, complex, sprawling cities on the coasts of India long before mainstream history says civilization even existed. And just as the ancient Hindu epics described, the ocean violently rose up and swallowed their world whole. The underwater ruins of Yonaguni and the Gulf of Cambay are the silent, drowned ghosts of the Great Flood. They are the physical proof that our ancestors' horrifying myths of rising waters are absolutely grounded in terrifying reality. But exploring the bottom of the ocean is exhausting, expensive, and dangerous. The sea closely guards her secrets, burying them under thousands of years of mud and coral. If we truly want to understand the brilliance of the people who survived the apocalypse 12,000 years ago, we cannot just look underwater. We have to come back up to the surface. We have to look at the dry land. Because the survivors of the Great Flood did not just run, they remembered. And on the highest hills of the ancient world, completely safe from the crashing waves, they decided to build something impossible. They built a massive stone time machine to warn us, their distant descendants, about the day the sky fell and the oceans swallowed the earth. Let us travel to the dry, dusty plains of modern-day Turkey to look at a discovery that is currently rewriting everything we know about the human race. As we have seen, the bottom of the ocean is a graveyard of secrets. From the mysterious terraces of Yonaguni to the sprawling, drowned streets of ancient Dwarka in the Gulf of Kambat, the evidence of a lost world is there. But it is buried under mud, salt, and crushing pressure. To truly confirm if our ancestors witnessed a global apocalypse 12,000 years ago, we need to find something on dry land. We need a smoking gun made of stone that was never touched by the rising tides. For a long time, historians believed that 12,000 years ago, human beings were nothing more than simple cavemen. The official story was that we were primitive hunter-gatherers who spent all our time just trying to find food. We didn't have cities, we didn't have religion, and we certainly didn't have the technology to move massive stones. According to the old history books, civilization only began about 5,000 years ago in Sumeria and Egypt. But in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt walked onto a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, which means belly hill in Turkish. What he found there didn't just add a new chapter to history. It ripped the old history books to shreds and threw them into the fire. Göbekli Tepe is a massive temple complex, but it's not just any temple. It is the oldest temple ever discovered on Earth. Through carbon dating of the organic material found in the soil, scientists confirmed that this site was built roughly 11,600 to 12,000 years ago. Does that date sound familiar? It should. It is the exact moment the Younger Dryas deep freeze ended and the Great Flood began. Standing at Göbekli Tepe is a surreal experience. It consists of several large circular enclosures made of massive, T-shaped limestone pillars. Some of these pillars are nearly 20 feet, 6 meters tall, and weigh over 15 tons. Imagine trying to move a 15-ton rock, the weight of 3 or 4 African elephants, without a crane, without a truck, and without even a simple wheel. Because 12,000 years ago, the wheel hadn't been invented yet. But it's not just the size of the stones that is shocking. It's the art. These pillars are covered in exquisite, high-relief carvings of animals, fierce lions, charging boars, scorpions, vultures, and snakes. The level of craftsmanship is so high that it looks like it was done by master stonemasons, not primitive nomads. So, why would cavemen suddenly decide to build a massive stone cathedral on a hill? And what does this have to do with the Great Flood? Many researchers, including figures like Graham Hancock and Martin Sweatman, believe that Göbekli Tepe is more than just a temple. It is a permanent record of the catastrophe. They point to one specific pillar known as the Vulture Stone, Pillar 43. On this stone, there is a strange collection of symbols: a vulture holding a circular object, a headless man, and various animals. Using sophisticated computer software that tracks the movement of the stars over thousands of years, archaeoastronomy, researchers have discovered that these animals are actually ancient zodiac symbols. The positions of the stars on the vulture stone align perfectly with the sky, as it appeared on one specific date, roughly 10,950 BC. This is the exact window when the Younger Dryas comet is suspected to have hit the Earth. The headless man on the stone is thought to represent the mass death caused by the impact and the resulting floods. It's as if the survivors of the apocalypse realized that their oral stories might be forgotten, so they carved the date and the event into the most permanent material they had: solid rock. They wanted to make sure that even 12,000 years later, we would know what happened to them. But Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated miracle. If we travel thousands of miles away, across the oceans to the tropical islands of Indonesia, we find another mystery that is currently shaking the foundation of archaeology. Welcome to Gunung Padang. At first glance, Gunung Padang looks like a normal, lush, green hill covered in broken basalt rocks. Local people have treated it as a sacred site for centuries, but when Dr. Danny Hillman Natawijaja, a senior geologist, began to study the hill with ground-penetrating radar and core drilling, he made a discovery that seems impossible. The hill isn't a hill at all. It is a giant, man-made pyramid. Using advanced technology that can see through the earth, the team discovered that Gunung Padang is made of multiple layers built on top of each other. The top layer is a few thousand years old, but as they drilled deeper, they found a massive chamber and older layers of construction. Carbon dating of the organic material found deep within the structure suggests that the oldest parts of Gunung Padang were built as far back as 16,000 to 25,000 years ago. This would make Gunung Padang the oldest pyramid on Earth, far older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. More importantly, its location is vital. Remember Sundaland, the lost continent of Southeast Asia? Gunung Padang sits on the high ground that survived the flooding of Sundaland. As the oceans rose and the lowlands were swallowed by the sea, the people of Sundaland would have been forced to retreat to the mountain peaks. It makes perfect sense that these survivors, who were likely part of an advanced coastal civilization, would build a massive, durable monument on the highest ground available. It was a beacon of their survival, a fortress against the rising water, and perhaps a temple to honor the world they had lost. But why did these sites, Göbekli Tepe and Gunung Padang, eventually disappear? This is perhaps the strangest part of the story. Göbekli Tepe wasn't destroyed by an enemy or ruined by time. It was carefully and intentionally buried. Around 8000 BC, the people who used the temple took thousands of tons of dirt and gravel and completely covered the entire site, creating an artificial hill. They effectively mummified the temple in the earth. Why would you spend centuries building a masterpiece only to bury it? Perhaps they knew another disaster was coming. Perhaps the memory of the Great Flood was still so fresh that they wanted to hide their most sacred knowledge in a time capsule, protecting it from the elements and future generations until we were ready to find it again. If we look at these sites without the bias of old history books, a new picture of humanity emerges. We weren't just primitive. We were a global species that was hit by a massive, watery reset button. Think of it this way. If a global flood happened today, and 99% of our technology was destroyed, what would the survivors do? They wouldn't be able to make microchips or cars anymore. They would have to go back to hunting and gathering. But they would still remember that they once flew in the sky and lived in great cities. They would tell their children stories about the gods who had great power. They might even try to build massive stone structures to remember their lost glory. This is exactly what we see at Göbekli Tepe, Gunung Padang, and even the Sphinx in Egypt. Many geologists, like Dr. Robert Schoch, the same man who studied Yonaguni, have pointed out that the Great Sphinx in Egypt shows signs of heavy water erosion. The patterns of weathering on the body of the Sphinx are vertical, which is only caused by thousands of years of heavy, torrential rainfall. The problem? Egypt has been a bone-dry desert for the last 5,000 years. The last time there was enough rain to erode the Sphinx was at the end of the Ice Age, roughly 12,000 years ago. This suggests that the Sphinx, or at least the original structure it was carved from, might be much older than we think. It might have stood there, watching as the skies turned black and the rains of the Great Flood hammered the North African coast. When we connect the dots, the evidence on dry land is overwhelming. We have a temple in Turkey that records a comet strike 12,000 years ago. We have a pyramid in Indonesia built on the high ground of a drowned continent. We have a giant statue in Egypt that bears the scars of ancient, apocalyptic rains. Our ancestors were trying to tell us something. They were shouting at us across the millennia, using the only language that survives time: stone. They wanted us to know that the Great Flood wasn't just a story. It was the event that defined the human race. It was the moment we lost our childhood and were forced to start over from scratch. But how did this memory survive so clearly in our minds? If the physical ruins were buried or drowned, how did the story stay alive for 12,000 years? To understand that, we have to look into the most powerful storage device on Earth: the human brain. We have to look at the psychology of survival and the beautiful, tragic way we turn our deepest fears into myths. At this point in our journey, we have seen the overwhelming physical evidence: the black lines in the dirt, the drowned cities beneath the waves, and the massive stone monuments built on the high ground of a changing world. But there is one final piece of evidence that is perhaps even more powerful than stone or silt. It is the evidence stored inside the human mind. How does a story survive for 12,000 years? To put that in perspective, 12,000 years is about 600 generations of human beings. That is a lot of grandfathers telling stories to their grandsons. In our modern world, we struggle to remember what happened 50 years ago without looking it up on our phones. So, why did our ancestors hold on to the memory of the Great Flood with such terrifying clarity? The answer lies in a concept called collective trauma. In psychology, a trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. When an entire society experiences that trauma at the same time, like a world-ending flood, it becomes a collective trauma. It weaves itself into the very fabric of that culture's identity. Imagine you are an ancient human. You don't just hear about the flood, you live through it. You see the ocean rise and swallow the village where your family has lived for 1,000 years. You hear the roar of the megafloods tearing down the valley. You lose your home, your elders, and your entire way of life in a matter of days. That kind of fear doesn't just go away, it changes your DNA. It becomes a survival instinct. To ensure the survival of the next generation, you have to pass down the warning. But you don't have a science textbook to explain Meltwater Pulse 1b or isostatic rebound. If you try to explain the complex physics of a collapsing glacier to your children, they might get bored and forget. But if you tell them a story about a great serpent that lived in the ice and woke up angry, or a god who sent the rain because humanity became too loud and wicked, they will never forget that. This is the birth of mythology as a storage device. Think of myths not as lies, but as compressed data files. Just like you compress a large video file so it can be sent over the internet, ancient people compressed complex geological events into easy-to-remember stories. Take the common theme of the angry god. From a scientific perspective, the Younger Dryas impact and the subsequent floods were random, chaotic, natural events. But the human brain hates randomness. We are programmed to look for patterns and reasons. If the world ends, we want to know why. By attributing the flood to a moral failure or a divine decision, the survivors gave the event a structure. It made the tragedy something they could process and, more importantly, something they could teach. If we are good, if we respect the earth, if we listen to the warnings, we will survive next time. This is also why the chosen survivor, or the hero, is so prominent in these stories. Whether it is Noah, Utnapishtim, Manu, or You the Great, these characters represent the triumph of human agency over a chaotic universe. They are symbols of hope. They tell us that even when the world is literally being torn apart, there is a way through. You build a boat, you climb the mountain, you dig the canals, you survive. But there's another fascinating psychological trick at play here: the universal archetype. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung proposed that all humans share a collective unconscious, a set of mental images and symbols that are hardwired into our brains from birth. The Great Flood is one of the most powerful archetypes in existence. It represents a reset. It is the ultimate grave and womb symbol. The water destroys the old corrupt world, the grave, and washes the earth clean so a new, better world can be born, the womb. This is why, even if a culture didn't experience the exact same flood at the exact same time, they were primed to adopt the story because it resonated with the way the human mind views change and catastrophe. However, we must address the telephone game effect. Over 12,000 years, the story was told in thousands of different languages. In the freezing north, the flood became the blood of a giant. In the tropical south, it became the wrath of a sea goddess. In the Middle East, it became 40 days of rain. Skeptics often use these differences to argue that the stories aren't real. They say, if the stories were true, they would all be the same. But they are making a mistake. They are looking at the decorations instead of the structure. If 10 people witness a car accident, they will all describe it differently. One will focus on the color of the car, another on the sound of the tires, another on the broken glass. But they will all agree on one thing: 2 cars hit each other. The global flood myths are exactly the same. The colors change, the names of the gods, the types of animals, the shape of the boat. But the accident is identical. The world was stable. A warning was given. The water rose and covered the high places. A few survivors started over. The fact that these stories are so consistent across cultures that were separated by oceans proves that they aren't just creative writing. They are the echoes of a real, physical event that was so terrifying it left a permanent scar on the human psyche. We also have to consider the role of oral tradition as a highly accurate technology. In modern Western culture, we don't trust memory. We trust paper and digital screens. But for tens of thousands of years, humans developed incredible techniques to keep memories accurate. They used rhyme, rhythm, and song. They turned history into sacred oral texts that were passed down with zero tolerance for error. Among the Aboriginal people of Australia, researchers have found stories about the coastline changing and islands being cut off from the mainland. When geologists mapped the sea level rise around Australia, they found that these stories perfectly match the geological changes that happened 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. This proves that human memory, when packaged in the right kind of story, can remain accurate for nearly 10 millennia. So, when we listen to the story of Noah or the legend of the 5 sons, we aren't just listening to myths. We are listening to the oldest form of news. We are hearing the voices of the people who stood on the edge of the world and watched it disappear. They didn't tell us these stories to entertain us. They told us these stories because they wanted us to remember how fragile our world is. They wanted us to know that civilization isn't a permanent thing. It's a fragile garden that can be washed away in a single season. This leads us to the final, and perhaps most important, part of our journey. We have seen the science, the history, the archaeology, and the psychology. Now, we have to ask, what does this mean for us today? If the world reset 12,000 years ago, what can we learn from the people who survived? How does the Great Flood change our understanding of who we are and where we are going? Our journey through the echoes of the Great Flood has taken us from the bottom of the Arabian Sea to the high plains of Turkey, and from the cold data of Greenland ice cores to the burning memories of our oldest myths. We have discovered that the story of the Great Flood is not a mere collection of fairy tales, but a global puzzle. When you put the pieces together, the 400-foot rise in sea levels, the sudden climate shock of the Younger Dryas, and the sophisticated ruins of Göbekli Tepe, a new history of humanity emerges. The message our ancestors left behind is clear. We are a species with amnesia. We have forgotten that we have survived the end of the world before. This 12,000-year-old catastrophe was the ultimate reset button for the human race. It forced us to leave behind the coastal paradises of Doggerland and Sundaland, pushing us into the mountains and river valleys where we eventually rebuilt the civilizations we know today. Understanding the Great Flood changes how we see ourselves. It teaches us that we are incredibly resilient. Our ancestors didn't just survive, they remembered. They carved their warnings into stone and wove them into the songs of their children so that we, their distant descendants, would understand the power of our planet. It reminds us that our Earth is a dynamic, living system that can change with violent speed. As we look toward the future, the Great Flood serves as a humble reminder. We live in a brief window of climatic stability, but history shows us that this stability is a gift, not a guarantee. By looking back at the day the world drowned, we learn to respect the forces of nature and value the incredible journey of human survival. Thank you for traveling back in time with me to solve one of history's greatest mysteries. If this journey has changed the way you look at our past, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden stories of our world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the past is never truly gone. It's just waiting to be rediscovered.